What if I told you that behind the most beautiful queen in medieval Europe, beneath the golden crown and the shimmering silk, there lurked a darkness so deep it would destroy two kingdoms? We've all heard the fairy tales, radiant princesses marrying noble princes, love conquering all. But what you don't see, what history tried to bury, is the real story of Isabella of France, the she-wolf, the queen they said consorted with beasts, plotted regicide, and turned motherhood itself into a weapon of war. This isn't a love story. This is the story of how a 12-year-old girl became the most feared woman in Europe, how innocence was murdered in a marriage bed, and how vengeance, when it finally came, was written in blood. The year is 1308. Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France, is about to marry Edward II of England. She's 12 years old. Imagine it. You're a child who's never left your father's palace. You speak only French, and tomorrow you'll be sent across the English Channel like a parcel of diplomacy to marry a stranger. This isn't romance. This is politics. Isabella isn't a bride. She's a bargaining chip, a treaty sealed in flesh between two warring kingdoms. But no one could have guessed that this terrified young girl would one day destroy the very throne she was sent to. Protect Edward II was not the king England expected. While other monarchs led armies and forged glory, Edward preferred the company of Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose charm and influence over the king would eclipse that of any queen. When Isabella arrived in England, speaking no English and expecting partnership, she found herself invisible, a royal decoration, a vessel for heirs, nothing more. On her wedding night, picture the horror. You are 12, dressed as a queen, trembling beneath velvet and gold. Instead of protection or affection, your husband leaves your bed to visit his male favorite's chambers. You lie awake in Westminster Palace, listening to the laughter echoing down corridors you'll never be allowed to enter. For years, Isabella played her role, the beautiful wife, the obedient queen. She bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III. But with every pregnancy, every lonely night while her husband showered his lovers with jewels and titles, something inside her hardened. In 1312, English barons captured and executed Gaveston. Edward's grief was uncontrollable. He wept for weeks, erected monuments in Gaveston's honor, and blamed everyone, especially Isabella. Her allowance was slashed, her servants dismissed, her letters intercepted. He turned his queen into a prisoner. But isolation breeds something more dangerous than rebellion. Breeds patience. It breeds intelligence. While Edward mourned, Isabella was studying, learning English law, memorizing court politics, discovering who could be trusted, who could be bought, and who could be destroyed. By 1318, a new favorite had replaced Gaveston, Hugh Despenser the Younger. But unlike Gaveston, Despenser didn't crave affection or status. He wanted power, real total power. He didn't just influence Edward. He controlled him. Despenser decided policies, distributed land, and condemned enemies, all in the king's name. And the besotted Edward handed him everything, including control over his wife. Isabella's movements were monitored, her children kept from her, her every correspondence read. When she protested, Despenser whispered poison into Edward's ear, accusing her of conspiring with France, branding her a traitor for the blood she was born with. Once again, Isabella found herself under house arrest. But those long, bitter years didn't break her. They educated her. The year is 1325. Isabella is 30, 17 years of humiliation behind her. And then fate intervenes. A diplomatic crisis erupts over Gascon lands. Someone must negotiate with the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother. Edward cannot go. The barons refuse, but Isabella, she is the perfect emissary. French by birth, English by marriage, fluent in both languages. And most importantly, she's a woman. Medieval queen, harmless, underestimated, invisible. Edward agrees, thinking she's no threat, even sending their son, young Prince Edward, with her to pay homage in France. But as Isabella's ship sails from Dover in March 1325, she's not thinking about peace. She's thinking about revenge. Paris welcomes her like a returning princess. Where Edward's court had caged her, the French court celebrates her, treating her as the intelligent, articulate, and dangerously perceptive woman she's become. And it's here, in the heart of her homeland, that Isabella meets Roger Mortimer. Mortimer is everything Edward isn't. A warrior who's actually fought battles. A man who escaped the Tower of London, the first ever to do so. He's bold, magnetic, and burns with the same hatred for Edward and Despenser that fuels Isabella's own. What happened next was unprecedented. A queen raised an army to invade her husband's kingdom, using her own son as justification. Isabella and Mortimer gathered English exiles, convinced King Charles IV of France to provide ships and soldiers, and promised England's barons they would remove the Despensers and reform the corrupt government. But their real plan was far simpler and far more dangerous. They would remove Edward II from the throne entirely. Their justification was elegant. Prince Edward, Isabella's 14-year-old son, was the rightful heir. If his father's reign was incompetent, if England's rule had become catastrophic, then a regency under Isabella would serve the realm far better. In September 1326, Isabella landed in Suffolk with a small army of mercenaries and English exiles. They expected resistance. Instead, they found a kingdom eager to surrender. Edward II's 20-year reign had been one disaster after another: military humiliation in Scotland, economic collapse, civil war with his own barons, and rule by favorites who cared more for wealth than for England itself. So when Isabella landed, claiming to act in her son's name, the people didn't see an invader. They saw a liberator. Town after town opened their gates. Baron after baron joined her cause. Edward fled toward Wales with Hugh Despenser, but there was nowhere left to run. In November 1326, less than 2 months after Isabella's landing, Edward II and Despenser were captured. Despenser's end was brutal: hanged, drawn and quartered in Hereford while Isabella watched from a balcony above. She wanted to see the man who had controlled her life pay for every cruelty. But Edward was a king. You don't simply execute a king. So Isabella devised something far more creative, far more permanent, and infinitely more cruel. On January 20th, 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son. Now King Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer would rule as regents. Edward himself was taken to Berkeley Castle, officially for comfortable retirement. Unofficially, everyone knew he would never leave alive. The official story said Edward died of natural causes in September 1327, a convenient heart attack. The unofficial story, whispered for centuries, told of something far darker: that Isabella and Mortimer ordered Edward's murder, a red-hot poker inserted through his rectum, burning his organs, killing him in agony but leaving no mark outside. The symbolism was cruelly deliberate. A king known for loving men, executed in a way that mocked his desires, while making his death appear natural. We'll never know if it's true. But Isabella never denied it. When called she-wolf, when accused of regicide, she remained silent, because sometimes being feared is far more powerful than being loved. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England through the young King Edward III. And at first, they ruled well. They made peace with Scotland, reformed the government, cleansed the court of corruption. But power corrupts, and soon Mortimer began acting like a king himself. He granted himself vast estates and titles, treating Edward III not as a monarch, but as a child to be managed. He and Isabella lived openly as lovers, scandalizing the court. They had forgotten that the frightened boy they once controlled was now becoming a man, and that men, especially kings, do not like being puppets. In October 1330, the 18-year-old Edward III struck back. His men stormed Nottingham Castle and captured Mortimer, who was, according to legend, found in bed beside Isabella herself. As guards dragged him away, Isabella cried out, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." But teenage kings show no pity. Mortimer was executed at Tyburn. No trial, no mercy. Isabella expected the same fate. Instead, her son offered her a choice: death or a lifetime of luxurious imprisonment. She chose life. For the next 28 years, Isabella lived at Castle Rising, surrounded by servants, wealth, and comfort. Yet forever confined. She could never remarry, never return to power. never escaped the gilded cage her son had built. The she-wolf became a caged wolf, well-fed, but powerless. In 1358, Isabella died at the age of 63. She was buried simply, Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of England. No mention of her victories, no mention of her crimes, because Isabella was never the monster they called her. She was a woman who refused to disappear. In a world where queens were meant to be silent, she spoke. When stripped of power, she seized it. When humiliated, she chose revenge. Every decision, her affair with Mortimer, the invasion, perhaps even the king's murder, was a choice between survival and surrender. And Isabella always chose survival. Her methods were brutal. Her love was scandalous. Her vengeance was unforgivable, but her legacy was undeniable. Her son, Edward III, became one of England's greatest kings. Her reforms endured for centuries. The peace she forged with France held for decades. Sometimes the monster is the savior. Sometimes the villain restores the kingdom. Sometimes the woman they call Beast is simply the only one brave enough to do what must be done. This isn't a tale of good or evil. It's a story of power and powerlessness, of survival and surrender. It's the price women pay for refusing to be victims. Isabella learned that marriage was war, that motherhood could be weaponized, and that love, for queens, was a luxury they could never afford. They called her she-wolf. But wolves protect their cubs. Wolves fight when cornered. Wolves survive when others surrender. Maybe being called a beast was never an insult. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe Isabella understood something we're still learning. That sometimes you must be willing to be called a monster to avoid becoming a victim, because behind every she-wolf is usually a little girl who was given no other choice. If this story changed the way you think about medieval queens, about how history tells some stories and hides others, then share it. Subscribe if you believe history should be honest, especially when it's uncomfortable. What other women were called monsters for doing what men were praised for? Leave a comment. Tell us whose story you want to hear next. The she-wolf died more than 6 centuries ago, but her howl still echoes through every woman who refuses to be silenced, who chooses survival over surrender. That howl isn't the sound of a beast. It's the sound of someone remembering she was never meant to be tamed.